Hello. Hello to everyone that's on the live stream. We're going to be starting in about 5 minutes. 5 minutes. Hello. Hello, everyone. This is an intimate setting, so we are using the microphone because we have quite a big following online. Hello to all of our online attendees. I'm quickly just going to introduce Deborah King, who's the Director of Startup at Berkeley Law. And without her and without our gracious volunteers, we would not be here for this most talked about workshop. So even though we've got minimal in-person attendance, this has been time and time again asked as this is the workshop that I want to know about. These are the things I want to know, and I want to hear it from lawyers, not from people that think they know. So without further ado, Deborah King.
Am I looking at that? Hi, all. So this actually could have come together without me, but it could not have come together without our speakers. Startup at Berkeley Law, for those of you who may not know, is the initiative that's run out of the law school where we teach founders the legal, financial, and operational aspects of starting and scaling your business. It's completely free. It's open to big ideas founders as well as founders just across campus. I feel weird talking to the camera and not to our people who are here, but I am also talking to you. This is a workshop that is near and dear to my heart because I think it's really important that we let founders know with a social focused goal that you don't necessarily have to be a nonprofit. There are other options for you. And so with that, I'm gonna let Jen and Jesse actually introduce themselves because they're much better at it than I am.
Sweet. Hello, everybody, people. I'm Jen Barnett. I'm an attorney at Cooley, Berkeley grad, actually. Jesse and I were classmates and still friends, yay, even though we work at different law firms. But we do very similar work. We both work with startups and particularly in the social impact space. I work with a lot of very early stage entrepreneurs like all of you. And I also work with investors, and we'll actually talk about kind of we'll go into a little bit about like the impact investing space as well.
And I'm Jesse, and I am an attorney at Morrison & Forrester, as Jen said, and work in our impact investing and social enterprise practice, which involves a lot of work with social entrepreneurs in setting up companies and forming companies and merging companies, and investors in also setting up companies, but setting up funds and working with companies to invest in them. So have really been enjoying that for the last few years, and yeah, get to do this every so often with Jen, and really enjoy this. So I think the way we were going to sort of talk about this is a couple key questions up front that we all need to sort of discuss these terms, impact investing, and these concepts that are kind of floated around out there. The other one is social enterprise. So what is impact investing? I like to think about it in sort of three categories as types of impact investors, three categories of impact investors. The first is, these impact first or kind of impact only investors. And you can think of foundations or even family offices in some cases. Public charities can make investments. So these are, they really are investments made to have an impact as opposed to make a return. The second is impact and returns kind of balance. So these are investors that are trying to have an impact and make a return at the same time. And the third is the sort of return first, like we're going to make some money on this deal, and it happens to be in solar farms or whatever, and so it's doing some sort of impact, but we're really about the returns. So it's really broad. I mean, what is impact investing? Is it debt? Is it equity? Yes. Is it from nonprofits or for-profits? Yes. Is it kind of all it's everything. It's how we're defining basically what is impact itself, and trying to do something good for the planet.
And the reason that
yes,
we're starting with this is because oftentimes when you're thinking about, starting your company or your nonprofit or whatever, you're just kind of, you have your venture, and you're like, it matters who you're going to be raising capital from. So that's why we're going into kind of this spectrum of, who are the players in this field. Because oftentimes, and we can kind of take a step back. This presentation is focused on kind of legal structures for social entrepreneurs. And if we were having this conversation at, Y Combinator or, just a plain vanilla, startup space, it would be a very short conversation. We'd be like, okay, you want to go raise venture money? You should be a Delaware corporation, and kind of end of story. But because we are, it's a lot more complicated when you're thinking about having a social impact, and where you fall on kind of this spectrum as well is something. There's some soul searching that you should be doing, and so we'll kind of get into that with. But I just kind of wanted to set that stage.
Yeah,
as well.
and the other thing, I mean, it's a really important topic to start with, because I think the number one thing you can do to embed impact into whatever enterprise you're starting is to have mission-aligned investors, to have people in there who support you, who realize your vision and understand your vision. If you, regardless of all the legal mechanics and sort of all the incentives you can build into documents and contract, agreements and all of this, the fundamental best thing you can do to ensure that your mission will succeed over time is to bring in people who believe in that mission as well.
And that's grant partners. That's that's the whole spectrum of, because if that relationship that you're building is really important to and it can be really just, if it goes wrong, it can be really costly in so many, just from a from you, not just financially, but from an emotional perspective as well. So we're here to kind of help you think that through. But this is kind of just the basics of how important it is to bring on the right kind of investor.
Yeah, and who are you talking to, right? Are you talking to a nonprofit? Are you talking with a for-profit investor who wants to have some impact on the side? Tailor your message. So similarly, there's what is a social enterprise? Man, this is also a very broad definite, very broad term, and people use it in all sorts of different ways. If you live in Silicon Valley and sort of buy into that sort of vision, then you think that creating an app that creates some sort of time-saving kind of thing is actually a social enterprise, because it's allowing people to save time and be more efficient, and that's a better thing for people in the world. But if you're coming from the nonprofit space, maybe social enterprise means something completely different. So yeah, a lot of are you for profit? Are you nonprofit? Yes. Are you a hybrid? Yes. So it means all sorts of different things. So then let's talk about what is a nonprofit.
That's what we're going to get into today. I guess I'm used to being very interactive, but because this is more of a presentation, I guess we're going to go through just the main types of entities that we find most helpful for social entrepreneurs. The most traditional is a nonprofit. And I would assume many of you might be thinking about forming a nonprofit. And kind of the basics of this, unlike a for-profit, where I was mentioning if you were starting just XYZ tech company, you're going to form as a Delaware corporation. Why Delaware? Because the majority of companies in the U.S. are formed in Delaware because Delaware has robust corporate law system. That it's their Secretary of State makes it very easy to process filings. I mean, there's a number of reasons. It's like the corporate law. They have a set judiciary that decides on corporate legal matters. So they make it very attractive for companies to form in Delaware. That's not the case in the nonprofit world. In the nonprofit world, wherever you are operating, you have to register with the kind of state attorney general. So it's most often recommended that you form in the state where you are. So, you guys, if you're thinking of kind of staying in Berkeley post-graduation, you should be thinking about California nonprofits. We have 3 types of California nonprofits. The Public Benefit Corporation, which is confusing for a number of reasons, because there's also in Delaware the most common, like this new form of entity that is a for-profit, is also called a public benefit corporation. But in California, it is a nonprofit. So it's a nonprofit public benefit corporation, which basically means that you are out to create a public benefit, and the assets that are being generated and held in the nonprofit are dedicated to the public. So you don't own anything as a nonprofit. The assets actually belong to the public. So you can be an employee of the organization, but there is no equity. There are no shares that you can give out as a nonprofit. There's also a mutual benefit corporation and a religious corporation. I would assume that those are like less relevant to this group. It would be helpful if you were thinking of forming like a church, or if you had some overt faith-based component to your social enterprise. Those might be that might be interesting. Kind of the process for how you would start a nonprofit is exactly the same for a for-profit. It's, you file a document with the Secretary of State. In this case, in California, it's called the Articles of Incorporation. And then the important piece of that is to think through your charitable or educational or public purpose. So that's like your mission statement. And that actually goes into this legal document that's being on file with the Secretary of State. You also, as part of this incorporation process, need to appoint a board of directors. And that can't just be you as the founder. You have to have at least a majority of the directors have to be independent, meaning they're not you, and they're not like your brother or sister or family member. They're not another employee of the organization. Those are kind of some of the basic requirements. And then you also have to have bylaws. You have to have meetings. There's kind of some consistency that comes with being an actual corporation. That's separate from filing for tax exemption. So one of the primary benefits that you get if you're thinking about like, why would I be a nonprofit over a for-profit, where it's easier for me to make money, I could actually own interest in the organization. One of the primary benefits is that it might be easier to fundraise, because you may be able to apply for tax exemption, and under a particular Federal exemption, Section 501c3, allows you to receive tax-exempt donations, meaning like if I am really interested in your company or your organization, I could donate to you and I would receive a break from my taxes. I would be able to deduct that amount of the donation on my taxes. And you as the organization also have the, like you are not subject to paying income taxes. So that's just, it's a tax break for both parties. 501c3s must have a religious, charitable, scientific, educational, I listed all of those, but those are typically the most common, purposes. The IRS looks closely at what you're doing. This is that same mission statement that's embedded in your articles of incorporation. Just so that we're clear, you have two kind of separate filing processes. You file the state filing in California, and then you have a filing with the IRS to get tax-exempt status. And the filing that you would make with the IRS is called the 1023. If you are thinking of kind of being a small nonprofit, you expect to have just kind of no more than $50,000 in revenue for the first couple, like 2-3 years, you might be able to use Form 1023 Easy, which is a much shorter, streamlined form that has a much faster turnaround time. The 1023, my experience lately has actually been like that they've been coming back from the IRS in about 4 months. But it can take a year. You just kind of don't know. But the Easy, I mean, those can come back in 3 weeks. So and the document itself takes so much less time to prepare because it's a 2-page document versus a 15, 20-page document that requires like financial statements and just kind of thinking through. It's a much more robust process. So these are areas, if you're thinking about working, if you're thinking that a nonprofit might be the right choice for you, there's actually a lot of opportunities to work with pro bono lawyers. To work with lawyers pro bono, meaning that we would not charge you to be able to do this kind of an incorporation. So that's just something to think about. Deborah has a wonderful network, and Jesse and I are always kind of doing this kind of work for nonprofits. So there are 2 types of nonprofits that and both of them follow under the 501c3 exemption. Oh, I should also mention that once you get federal tax exemption, you use that same determination to then apply for California state tax exemption. And so that's something that you would it's helpful to work with a lawyer on this, although not necessary. You can you can DIY it, but because these processes, if you're it's just helpful to have some guidance.
Yeah, I think it's helpful to have guidance, and we're seeing a little bit longer, sort of in the 6 months, sort of 6 to 8 month range. But I think my understanding is there was a big backlog for a while. It's sort of slowly catching up. On the 1023s. Yeah, these are pretty long documents, but the thing is, they're effective retroactively, so you can actually deduct all of the expenses. I think it's 27 months is the time period that it sort of reaches back to. So if you are accepting donations in the first week or 2 that you form your company, that you actually form in California, then you get your 1023 within that time period. It's retroactive, so all of those donations that people gave you, that would be tax deductible going back in time.
So we have a question from online. What was the cutoff in terms of the amount of funding that you would, if you had X amount, that you should do Easy or not?
Question online was, what was the cutoff for funding for the 1023 Easy versus the full 1023? And it's $50,000 over 3 years. So it's each year for the next for up to for 3 years. So
and
it's expected. Yeah, obviously, you can't predict the future, but if you're thinking, no, we're going to be going out to the Gates Foundation, for a huge, $1 million grant, you obviously should not use the Easy. If you're like, no, we're going to be starting here in Berkeley, we may do a crowdfunding because we think that but our goal is really to just kind of help the Berkeley community with some local project, then the Easy might be the right choice for you. So it really depends on, but it's kind of we would use, and this is like the standard that we use all the time in the law, but like a reasonableness standard. So would a reasonable person at the IRS see, they're not going to penalize you if you end up, making $80,000 year 3, but if you're like, no, we were, you can't in good faith, if you're applying for a huge grant, say that you use the the easy. So,
And
good
the
question.
IRS has some pretty helpful guides around the Easy 1023. So I would recommend some people looking it up on the IRS website, and then of course talking with an attorney.
Yeah.
And the other reason, of course, it's good to have an attorney is because sometimes the IRS comes back and has questions,
Right.
and you want to be able to respond to those questions kind of in an effective way that gets to what the IRS is looking for. So oftentimes that involves a tax attorney.
Yeah, I know. But we're gonna skip. So we were talking this entire time about public charities, which I'm assuming most of you are would be thinking about. This is in contrast to a private foundation, and I'll just kind of talk about that briefly. But a private foundation is basically they're also a 501c3 organization, so meaning that like donations to them are tax deductible, but it's coming from a single donor primarily. So Google has a Google Foundation, or Salesforce has their Salesforce Foundation, or Gates has the Gates Foundation. But these are high net worth companies or individuals that are, and then those then become grant-making organizations. So unless you're thinking about being a grant-making organization, this really isn't applicable to you. There's some specific rules around that, but I think most of it, like what we talk about, are forming public charities, and there's some very specific rules around how you would operate. I don't know if you want to go into.
Yeah, these will come back later as well. And then just to note, the default if you are applying for a 501c3 is actually a private foundation, and in order to get out of the private foundation status, you have to meet what's called a public support test, and that is you're deriving, it's more or less a third of your donation of your revenue is from the public, sort of broadly. And then if you fail to meet that test, then the IRS will push you back into private foundation status, which always hurts a little. And so some of the keys up here are to the public charity, and this will come back when we discuss hybrid enterprises, so for-profit nonprofits that are working together. But our private inurement, basically, as Jen was saying, this nonprofit holds its assets in the public trust, and it can't be using those assets to benefit private individuals. So private benefit is the second one. They're slightly different terms. One's talking about insiders, the other's talking about more broadly, but they're the same concept. No private benefit, private inurement. You have to operate for your tax-exempt purpose. So you actually have to, your chief operating activities have to be in furtherance of your tax-exempt purpose, whatever that might be. And then there's you can't get involved in electioneering. You can't get involved in lobbying. So if you want to do that, you basically need to set up another entity, which we're not talking about today, but it's a C4.
Yeah. Any questions from this audience on kind of nonprofits generally, or from? Yes.
Yeah. So this is a question about about operating with no private benefit, private inurement. Yeah. So.
Question too.
The question, as I understand it, is if you are one of these impact investors who's impact first or impact only, would you still be counted as a private sort of beneficiary for the purposes of this no private inurement, no private benefit analysis? Just nod if that was more or less the question. I think so. Yeah. Okay. The answer is actually, as a nonprofit, you can make investments into private enterprises. First of all, so you can do that in a couple of different ways, but essentially you can't do very much of it unless it's really oriented toward your tax-exempt purpose, your social or your environmental mission. Then as a private, private benefit, private inurement kind of question, you can have, these are not, nonprofits are not private entities, they're public entities. So any of their investments that's sort of coming back up to them through their investment activities is going back and being held in the nonprofit entity itself, not by the owners of the nonprofit, because remember, there are no owners of the nonprofit. So all of the investments are being held by that nonprofit entity and being used. They have to again be used, those revenues be used in furtherance of the tax exempt purpose. So so I think if that's more or less,
The way that private inurement and private benefit kind of come up the most is, like, let's say that I'm starting I have a nonprofit, but I also have a consulting business that I run on the side. And like I've started the nonprofit, I'm on the board of the nonprofit wants to contract with my consulting business. That can be a potential, that it could implicate very, very easily private benefit issues. So those are the kinds of things that you'd have to be aware of.
Another sort of example is just two parties contracting with each other. If a nonprofit and a for-profit entity, and it could be anything. It could be a vendor, right? And you have to make sure that the nonprofit is not paying more than fair market value for to that private, actor.
And we're going to get into we'll kind of talk a little bit more about this when we were talking about hybrid organizations, because that's one of the most complicated features. And we'll get into what that, we're kind of jumping ahead, but that's one of the most complicated features of running a hybrid organization, or using a nonprofit and a for-profit that operate together. But those are kind of the two types of nonprofits, generally speaking, 501c3 organizations. Most of you would be thinking about a public charity and incorporating maybe in California or in New York or another state. The most common for-profit structures we'll get into today, there is kind of a menu available to social entrepreneurs. It used to be just you have an LLC and you have a corporation. Now there are all sorts of cool legal innovations that have happened over the last few years. So we'll go into some of those. And I do want to be mindful of the time. So we'll go through some of these more quickly than others. Do you want to talk about the LLC?
Sure, yeah. So the LLC stands
for Limited Liability Company.
Yep, Limited Liability Company. It's what they call a pass-through taxation entity. So it's only taxed at the individual level. So a corporation is taxed on the revenue and the income that the corporation generates, and then when the corporation pays its stockholders, those stockholders also are taxed. An LLC is, if you elect to be taxed as a pass-through entity, an LLC will flow all of those revenues and incomes up to the individuals who own the LLC, and so they are just taxed as the owners of the business. So it's not taxed at the entity level. It wouldn't be taxed at the company level. And that's really the biggest distinction between a corporation and an LLC, and a corporation we'll talk about more in a minute. The LLCs tend to be easier to operate, especially initially, and small scale. So I think for a lot of social entrepreneurs who it's a couple of founders, and maybe you're bringing on a little bit of capital. It might be in the form of some debt. It might be friends and family kind of round. Operating an LLC is just easier and cheaper than operating a corporation. So oftentimes we'll recommend that companies start out as an LLC, grow up for a year or two, and then when they're ready to bring on sort of bigger investors, more capital, kind of build out their organization a bit more, then switch to a corporate form. The sister of the first kind of social enterprise version of the LLC came along a number of years ago, the L3C, and it's almost not even worth talking about. It's almost not even worth talking about because it hasn't been. It's just not been adopted in many states. But the idea is interesting because it's sort of geared toward allowing foundations to invest in these private entities. L3C stands for
So Jesse mentioned earlier that private foundations are actually allowed to invest in for-profit enterprises. There are two ways they can do that: through mission-related investments or program-related investments, PRIs or MRIs. And so PRIs they require a lot of diligence by a foundation to make sure that it truly is a mission-first investment opportunity. And so this entity, the L3C, was structured to maybe open up more access to PRIs, but that has not been the case. Like we found that the IRS hasn't kind of blessed it, and so foundations doing PRIs are still having to go through kind of all of the same diligence. There's no it's like, okay, great, you're an L3C, we still have to kind of diligence you as if you were like a regular LLC or a corporation.
And
so
part of the reason there isn't as big of an uptake is because LLCs are incredibly flexible entities, and in fact that might be one of their best values. So you can these are creatures of contract. They are, they fundamentally sort of live in what's called an operating agreement, which just all the parties agree to the terms of this operating agreement. And so you can build in a mission. You can build in sort of incentives to further the mission. There's all sorts of things. It's just what everybody, there's sort of a skeleton, a framework that the Delaware Corporate Code and most states' corporate codes use as a background, but really they're creatures of contract.
Yeah.
And I would say in California, you can't contract around your fiduciary duties in an LLC, but in many states you can. And so you actually set fiduciary duties aside altogether, which can free you up to pursue things like mission.
And by fiduciary duties, we mean in kind of the general corporate understanding is based on Delaware law, and there's this idea that shareholders, that the purpose of the corporation is to maximize value for the shareholders, and oftentimes that's interpreted in the immediate term, not in the longer term best interest of the company. And so that's why we've had kind of these new types of entities created, because there's been this, okay, well, we have to we can't be a mission-first organization because we have to ultimately be thinking about the shareholders. That's pretty easy if you're one owner, but if you start thinking about okay, well, we're gonna raise some money and we're gonna bring on a couple of other people to help capitalize the company, being truly mission-driven becomes a little bit harder as a traditional corporation. So
yeah.
that's what we mean by fiduciary duties in the traditional context. LLCs. I would say the pros are, again, the flexibility that you have in terms of how you can, there's so much you can do in contracts. The con can also mean that can be more costly if you, because it's not standard, so if you're thinking about doing something really creative, and you're putting that into an agreement, you're working with an attorney to help draft that. It's not an off-the-shelf type agreement that we can just kind of give to you. So it might be a little bit more expensive in that regard, to the extent that you're being creative in how you're kind of
Yep.
setting that up.
Yep. And if you start bringing in more and more people.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and trying to offer them equity. That's probably one of the most complex features of an LLC, is if you're starting to hire employees and you want to give them equity of the LLC, it's a lot harder, as we find that it tends to be more expensive from on the company side, if you were doing it as a for-profit. That just the way that you can structure an equity incentive plan is a lot easier as a corporation. I mean,
no question.
Yeah. So those are just kind of the basics of the LLC. We've already talked a little bit about the corporation, but we can kind of go into one of a corporation, and we mentioned this when we were talking about the nonprofit corporations. They're actual you can be a nonprofit corporation, or if you are, you would be a stock corporation, meaning that you file a certificate of incorporation in Delaware or articles of incorporation in California, and it can be it's a pretty simple document. It can get more and more complex, but it's basically outlining the purpose of the company, which is usually to do anything lawful, unless you're going to form as one of these new companies, in which case you'll have an additional mission. But that's actually what we usually write, is anything under lawful. And then you also have the rights and privileges associated with the stock. And so this comes in if you're thinking about raising capital. So in a traditional kind of like venture world, you have the founders who will have common stock, and the employees of the company will have common stock, and then you'll offer preferred stock to VC investors, or even kind of your angel or friends. They often will take a different class of stock that has other rights associated, other economic preferences, certain payback rights that are not. We can teach a whole class on what preferred stock would be, but that's all baked into this charter document that's on file publicly with the Secretary of State in the wherever you're incorporated, and then you also have bylaws, which are kind of the rules of the road of the organization. And unlike LLCs, where we've said it's a creature of contract, meaning like you can set up, you don't ever have to have you don't have to have a board, you don't have to have board meetings, you don't have to, as a corporation, you have actual duties that are governed by the law. Like if you're forming a corporation, you have to have board meetings, you have to have like shareholder meetings, you have to report. You have, like shareholders have certain rights. It's very different from just kind of from the LLC. In practice, it doesn't have to be all that different, but just kind of theoretically, those are the kind of the main differences between.
Which is why that's the reason, that stability, that sort of built-in structure is why investors like corporations more than LLCs. They're sometimes a little squeamish of the flexibility of an LLC, and what if that big operating document has not been drafted quite correctly and they get squeezed out.
And they have to read that whole operating
right.
Agreement as opposed to
right.
a more standard set of.
So I would say the other thing to touch on here is this idea of the business judgment rule, which sort of underlies the fiduciary duties in a corporation. And so these fiduciary duties, as Jen was talking about, was it basically involved when a decision has to be made in terms of that involves financials of the business. How does the management, the board, think about weighing, the stockholders' pecuniary interest, their financial interest, versus what they might think is in the best interest of the company long term, or what they think is the right thing to do. How can a company go with a clothing provider that costs twice as much if they're supposed to be looking out for the best interest of their shareholders? Well, there's this thing called the business judgment rule, which gives wide latitude to boards and managers of companies to make decisions in what they think is the best long-term interest of the company, of the corporation. And so you can fit a lot under the business judgment rule, and that's why some of the most successful social enterprises are actually just corporations, because they believe that they are, by doing something good, by making a decision that is good for the planet or good for society in some way, they are actually strengthening their business. They're growing their market share. They can go out to consumers and talk about what it is that they're doing that's good in the world, and that is a long-term
sustainability report.
Right. The CSR, right, and the long-term sort of benefits to the shareholder outweigh what might be more advantageous to the shareholder in the short term. So that business judgment rule does a lot of work, and it's just a thing to keep in mind as you're weighing all the different options for what we're going to talk about next.
Yeah, the one kind of area where the rubber hits the road in a corporation is in the context of an acquisition, and in the context of an acquisition, you really do have to maximize the short-term value. If the shareholders are being cashed out, they have to get the highest price. So if, let's say you have your awesome social enterprise, you're thinking about, you get an offer from, friendly, company that you would love to, continue working with, and but they're not offering the same extent as, the evil, terrible, they're going to fire all the employees and, move the company to wherever, that nobody wants to be or whatever, So you have, but they're offering more. You have to go with evil company. You can't go with like the cool, awesome like acquirer that you wanted to go to. So that's like, that is the one area where, social enterprises, it doesn't come up very often, but it is a reason why we've had these new corporate forms that have emerged in the last decade, really.
Yeah.
Was the first one, I think, was in 2010 in Maryland. So
Yep.
we have this new type of corporation called the Benefit Corporation, and we also have a public benefit corporation, which I mentioned is the same as the nonprofit name in California. So it's a little confusing, but in Delaware it's called the PBC. And then in California, we also have a social purpose corporation, the SPC. So we'll talk about all of these, but they're slightly different. The Benefit Corporation was, how many of you have heard of B Corps? And that means, so a lot of people have, seen the B with the circle around it. There's, Patagonia, a lot of, there's Etsy used to be. There's a lot of companies out there that are certified B Corps, which means that they have, scored a certain, a metric on an impact assessment, and then they've been verified by this nonprofit organization called B Lab that they're, kind of creating some, social good. The whole Benefit Corporation model was launched by that same nonprofit, and so they purposefully, created this, I think, confusion around B Corp being everything. But there's actually a difference between the Benefit Corporation, which is your legal form, and the B Corp certification, which is just a certification that you pay for ongoing use to be able to use the B Lab trademark.
So when we talk about Benefit Corporation, we're talking about the legal entity, like an LLC, like a corporation, like a partnership, not the certification, which is, like fair trade or organic certification.
Right. And it's a little even more confusing because B Lab actually wants you to convert into a benefit corporation, and they make that one of the requirements to become a certified B Corp. Is that you do have to become a benefit corporation. But okay, what is a benefit corporation? It is a new legal form. It's been adopted in I think 37 states at this point, and a lot of countries around the world are now considering this kind of a model. A lot of places don't have the same kind of fiduciary duties issue that we have with how far you can take impact when it diverges from shareholder value, but we're just kind of seeing this as a new movement in corporate law. The corporate purpose is to create a general public benefit. And what does that mean? Generally, this means kind of having a positive social or environmental impact taken broadly. You're producing, a beneficial product to, that promotes some value to an underserved community. There's lots of ways that this can take form, but it allows you to kind of wear your heart on your sleeve, saying that you are impact and profit driven. The fiduciary duties are different. Instead of just thinking about your shareholders, you now are required to think about a whole range of stakeholders, including your shareholders. That's an important group, obviously. They're still the owners of the company, and so you still have duties to them, but you also have to think about your employees, your customers, your suppliers, the impact that you're having on the local community, your operations, the impact on the environment. So these are actually outlined. There's a whole list of all of the things that you have to think about when you're making decisions at the board level.
That's what we sort of call the general purpose, as your general benefit, looking at all the kind of stakeholders.
Yeah, and then you also have to report on how you're pursuing that public benefit. So you're thinking, there's transparency requirements, and there's also these a new enforcement mechanism for shareholders to be able to sue a company for not pursuing their mission. So if you say it kind of prevents that, greenwashing. We have, in the impact space, we have impact washing, and so that can be a concern. And so this is one of the, kind of tools that we haven't seen any kinds of lawsuits. There's been absolutely no litigation for, so we have no guidance from courts on how any of these new forms are actually going to be interpreted. But it's because it's new, and
we're all really excited for that to happen.
I know. We shouldn't be. We want all these companies to succeed and not actually have litigation. That's the best thing for everybody. But yes, question.
Why would you switch from being
Oh, Etsy was a certified B Corp. Sorry, the question was, why would you switch out of being a benefit corporation into something that's not? And Etsy is a unique case. Etsy is a publicly traded company. They were private. They were, they're a venture-backed company, and they were certified as a B Corp. One of the first, I think, kind of bigger companies to become certified. They'd been certified for a long time when B Lab kind of created this standard. They were thinking about converting to a benefit corporation. And they were thinking about converting to the Delaware PBC, which is what we're going to go into next, because they're incorporated in Delaware. Before going public, they did not do so. They went public as a traditional corporation, and B Lab basically said, you need to convert. It's part of their kind of, they have now a legal requirement that all of their certified companies be benefit corporations or PBCs. Some of this new type of form, if it's available in the state that you're incorporated in, you have to be one of these new entities. It's hard for Etsy as a public company to convert to a PBC. It's really challenging. It requires a 2/3 majority vote, and when you have such a broad shareholder base as as Etsy has, it's hard to do that. They chose not to pursue that as a course, and so they lost their certification. But it was kind of a big thing in the impact community was this. But I don't know. It's been received in kind of two different ways. We only have there's one. We're going to go into the PBC. We'll talk about that, but there is only one. I mean, when you think about kind of growth trajectory and of these new types of entities, we only have one publicly traded PBC. We've had a few exits and M&A that have happened, but it's all this is still pretty new. So
I think for converting out of a benefit corporation form, it's pretty. I haven't seen it happen very often. It's usually people are converting in. But some reasons are if you are purchased and the company that purchases you doesn't want you to be a benefit corporation, that you might convert out. Let's say something goes wrong with your company and the stockholders decide this is too risky, or for whatever reason they want you to focus more on your sort of money-making side than your mission side. The stockholders might elect you to convert. But yeah, there's not a ton of those that I've seen. The most common case I can think of would be an exit, would be a sale, an acquisition.
Yeah, or the mission drift, which you mentioned.
Mission
which is
drift.
Just that they, founder or is no longer with the company, and the other stockholders believe that the company should be doing something more profitable, and that it's counter to they shouldn't be a mission-driven company. Yeah. These are kind of like the basic breakdown of how we kind of talked about this, but there's a different purpose. The governance is different. You have different fiduciary duties. You have this transparency requirement. You have to report on how you're pursuing a public good. And then in many states, you have this special enforcement proceeding to be able to sue to enforce the mission. We've talked a little bit about the PBC, and the SPC stands for Social Purpose Corporation. In California, it's kind of a unique place. We have two of these new types of entities. We have a benefit corporation, and then we also have a social purpose corporation. And actually, the partner that Jesse works with the most, and who I'm co-teaching this class at the law school, was the primary drafter of the SPC in California. So near and dear to our hearts. But I would say most of the companies that we work with, at least, who are thinking about one of these new entities, are thinking about the Delaware PBC because they're thinking about becoming. They want to raise venture money. They want to kind of have that hockey stick growth curve. So they're thinking that to be in Delaware makes the most sense for them, but they are mission driven, and so they want to be a PBC, which allows them to pursue a general public benefit and operate in a sustainable and responsible manner. Those are the requirements. That public benefit is something that you articulate in your article, in your charter, in your certificate of incorporation. So it's exactly the same kind of process that you'd be doing as a nonprofit corporation. You're doing for a public benefit corporation. So you're thinking about what is it that we are going to be able to measure and report on? What is it that's truly our North Star? Why are we doing what we're doing?
But
And-
shouldn't be too broad, right?
Exactly.
It shouldn't be saving the world because what does that mean? And it shouldn't be too narrow. It shouldn't be saving dehydrated plants on Berkeley campus, because if it's too broad, it doesn't mean anything. If it's too narrow, you are just taking away the entire flexibility of the company to pursue kind of what it needs to pursue in order to fulfill sort of the broader underlying core mission.
I would say that's just probably one of the most fun parts of our job is like helping companies think through what should be their public benefit purpose.
I like to think about it in terms of, why are you doing this? What is it that you're doing? Not how are you achieving your goal, but what is your goal?
Right. And then the fiduciary duties are similar to a benefit corporation, but you are limited. It's like the benefit corporation has this broader, like you remember you have to consider all of these stakeholders. The PBC and SPC model is that you are really only accountable to your mission that you've articulated in your charter, your stockholders, and the kind of those that are most affected by the company's conduct. So if you're thinking about an acquisition, it would be your employees. Maybe in some kind of decisions it would be your suppliers, your customers, but it's not thinking about all of them all the time, which is like kind of the difference. There's no special enforcement proceeding. Reporting is slightly different. You're not, we're getting into the weeds here, but it's a different standard that you're using. And in Delaware, you actually don't have to publicly report. It's just a requirement to deliver this benefit report to your shareholders. In California, with the SPC, you actually do have to publicly post it to your website.
I think the only other thing I want to touch on with the PBC really is noting that we've seen this come up a couple times recently. Companies that have grown to a certain size, who are started out as corporations but then converting into public benefit corporations, are sort of facing this issue around dissenters' rights and appraisal rights. So if you do convert, it gives the opportunity of some of your investors to cash out early, to say, well, we don't actually believe in that mission and then in the direction that you're going in the company, so we'll just take our money from our stock instead. And that costs a lot for these companies that oftentimes don't have that money to just give out to shareholders. So because of that, it's becoming clear that it's harder and harder to convert at a later stage. And so if you want to be a PBC, it's better to sort of set that up earlier on while you have a few shareholders. And then everybody who comes on later buys into that already, buys into the vision of the company.
Sorry, and we skipped over one new entity as well that was just created last year in Delaware called the Public Benefit LLC, which is basically they're taking some of the structures of the PBC model and taking that into their LLC code.
Yeah. We've seen a couple of these, and impact investor funds are using them. So you build in a social or environmental mission statement into your articles that you file with the state, and then also into your operating document. You go back into that operating agreement that we talked about for the LLC. It's the same structure as an LLC, but with this additional fiduciary duty requirement that you need to pursue this other social or environmental mission.
Yeah. And I would say that like most of the companies that I work with that are choosing to be either a benefit corporation or a PBC are thinking about this because of the branding that it creates and the image. It's more of a communication tool, and they're finding that it's actually really effective as a communication tool to be able to hire great people who are aligned with the mission, to be able to go out and make connections with customers and suppliers. So they're utilizing this in the same way that companies utilize the B Labs certification, the B Corp certification, but without having to go through, they're just using it as another way to kind of brand their business.
It's also a signal to investors,
Yes.
And it helps companies bring on mission-aligned investors. And so because of that, it is an important tool for investors. But going back again to one of our first comments early on, it really matters who your investors are if you're going to have a for-profit entity. And so this is one way to sort of corral them and make it apparent to them that they are buying into this mission as well.
Yeah, and so we just have some of the like challenges up on this slide here. There's still, as we mentioned, there's been no litigation. There's no guidance on how these are going to be, these when things kind of come up against each other, like profit and purpose, like how is it going to be interpreted? We don't really have anything. So there, because it's still new, there's that confusion over like everybody calling everything B Corps. I hope that like if you have one takeaway from this presentation that like, don't refer to everything as a B Corp, like really dig down and ask like, okay, are you a benefit corporation? Are you PBC? What does that mean? And then maybe are companies like not complying with their reporting requirements? I know that some of
Some
people
shareholders
that I know.
waive, yeah, some, yeah, it's, sometimes it becomes an issue. Usually it's just handled internally.
Yeah. So really quickly, we've kind of mentioned this idea of operating both a for-profit and a nonprofit and like working them together in some way. There's two different like names for this. Sometimes it's called a tandem. Sometimes it's called a hybrid organization. I'm surprised that you guys use Tandem now.
I know. I've lost the battle.
And we won't go too deep in this because I realize that we're kind of running up against the time. And I actually don't, both of us don't think, I'm going to speak for you, I hope it's not problematic.
Nope, I know what you're going to say, and
that
I already agree.
Neither of us think that this is a great, is usually optimal for early stage entrepreneurs because of how complicated it is to just run one single entity. Imagine like, okay, so we've gone through the requirements of, having to, create a board as a nonprofit, you have to kind of think through all of like how your fiduciary duties, running the organization. And then you also add on top of that, a whole other entity that you also have to like think about how you're structuring, how those two are working together. Remember the nonprofit is public assets, so any relationship that you have with the for-profit is going to have to require a lot of conscientious thinking around how to do that in a way that's not going to jeopardize the nonprofit's tax-exempt status.
To do these well, they're expensive and
Yeah.
they're hard to administer. So, I mean,
But a lot of people in the social enterprise community are like, oh my gosh, we can be a nonprofit and we can take donations and we can be a for-profit and we can go out to impact investors. And so we're just going to do both at the same time. And I'm like, okay, great. Maybe that's going to work for you after a couple of years, after you've proven your business model and you figured out. But really, take away from this presentation, takeaway 2 would be think about what is it that you're going to be doing, and who are you going to be who's going to fund you tomorrow to do this. Those are kind of when we're thinking about how having a conversation with an early stage entrepreneur. What is your mission? Yeah. Where are you? Where do you see yourself in a year? How are you going? Who are you going to be going out to get funding?
Yeah. So if you're going to be raising predominantly donations, go with a nonprofit. If you're going to be raising capital from investors that are seeking returns, go with a for-profit. Depending on how that investor balances returns and impact, that might sort of lead you to a corporation or an LLC versus a public benefit corporation or a PB LLC.
Yeah. Do you want to make a lot of money off of this? Is this are you developing a technology that you then think you can license and sell? That's another kind of just personal question that you have to dive deep inside.
So don't do a tandem unless you have to. Right. Is the bottom line.
And we have slides on all of there's obviously total benefits, but it's really complicated. And so we both think that unless you have to.
Yeah, unless you have to, don't do it. But I will say they are cool. They're really they're very
fun,
special.
especially from a legal perspective.
Yeah,
we just get into the weeds around.
Totally, and
and when done well, they can be really really successful.
Very successful. Yeah. I mean,
one of the organizations that actually I think you work with, Medicines 360,
right,
is the first public, they're the first nonprofit drug company, and so they are pharmaceutical company. They've developed a
501c3. Yeah. So what they did was they created an IUD product, and they created a joint venture, this for-profit joint venture with another pharmaceutical company, And that joint venture sells the IUD in the market in the US and Canada and Europe and other sort of wealthy places in the world. And then the profits from that flow up through royalties back up to the nonprofit, and the nonprofit uses that to subsidize giving out this IUD to the rest of the world. And so here you have a system where you have this for-profit, nonprofit, joint venture, these complicated license agreements that flow revenue back up to the nonprofit that then allows the nonprofit to not be dependent on donation dollars, right? They have this flow of capital and pursue their mission at the same time. So they can, these
they can
can
be super effective,
really
really
effective,
great,
really interesting organizations.
But like, how much lawyer time goes into having to
Look,
put something like that
Medicine
together?
360 had like a $600 million anonymous donation. And so sure, like, yeah, put a bunch of lawyers on that and we'll create a beautiful structure for you. But you know, most organizations don't have that. And most, you know, are kind of bootstrapping and they're starting up and they're, yeah, so start simple, grow over time, and form follows function. So, you know, what are your core activities going to be? Are you going to be engaging in the marketplace? Are you going to be donating your services? And then where's your funding coming from? Those are the kind of questions you want to be thinking about as you're thinking through this tree of decisions.
Yeah. And so we have, you know, these slides are available to you. There's, you know, if you are thinking about this complex, like, kind of hybrid tandem relationship, there are some structures that you can, you know, think through. But again, we don't recommend it unless you absolutely have to. And then we have some, I mean, MoFo has awesome resources in their impact space. Cooley has a free, if you're interested in forming a PBC, you can do it yourself on Cooley Go. So that's another great resource.
And Jen's a resource.
And so, yeah, Jesse is too. So we're around. We're happy to answer questions. And thank you.
Receive some investment. So
It depends on the incubator. So some incubators will take only for-profits, others will take nonprofits, and they'll do that investment in terms of a grant, right?
Okay.
So I think you need to talk with the incubator and see what they're comfortable with. But a lot of for-profit incubators, you know, exist out there. But this, you said it was Harvard?
Hardware.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, hardware. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. I don't know. I would talk with your incubator. I've seen both.
Okay. And if it's for profit, like the one that you advise us, it's PBC, like public.
A PBC.
PBC.
Yeah. PBC would be a public benefit corporation. If you want to build in mission into your entity, that's a good option. Or a PB LLC or even an LLC might be a good option. You know, depending on how much investment they're bringing, you might bring in, on what type. You know, is it debt versus equity? If you're doing equity investments and this incubator is going to be putting in, giving you money, and you're going to be issuing shares, you know, of stock to that incubator, then you probably want to go with a corporation like a PBC.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
So you mentioned about benefit corporation versus PBCs, and most of the things look similar to me. And the one thing I caught is that PBCs operate in a sustainable manner. Is that the only difference between them?
No, there's actually a lot of differences, but it really does get into the weeds. And the benefit corporation, I would say the main difference is like that. Remember, I was saying that broader set of stakeholders that the directors are accountable to, and thinking through every single decision that the company's making. You have to consider the employees, the environment, your suppliers, you have to consider all of them. Whereas the PBC, you have to consider your shareholders, the mission of the organization that you've determined, not like the broad public benefit mission that is outlined in the benefit corporation statutes. So the purpose is different, the fiduciary duties are different, but it is it's not easy. It's not super easy to articulate the differences.
I think one way you can think about it is almost if they're kind of inverse of each other in some ways. So the benefit corporation requires a general public purpose and allows for a specific purpose. So you can kind of say, well, we're doing this general public purpose, but also we're doing, fighting poverty. And whereas the PBC requires the specific purpose and then allows for other purposes to be added. And so they're kind of, in that way, they kind of switch the emphasis of what it is the company should be looking for, and as a result, the fiduciary duties and so forth.
I see. Thank you.
Any other questions? All right. Yeah, thanks so much. Another round of applause. This is great. So thank you both. And for those of you joining online, thanks for tuning in. We will share the slides with everyone after this. So
Yeah, and you can share our email